The audition that changed everything. The hallway outside the audition room felt colder than it should have been, not because of the air conditioning, but because of the quiet pressure that settled into the walls whenever hope and uncertainty gathered in the same place. Sandra Bullock sat alone on a narrow bench, her script folded so many times that the creases had softened the paper like fabric. Around her, other actors whispered lines under their breath or stared at the floor as if answers might appear there, but Sandra kept her eyes forward, fixed on the closed door at the end of the hall. She wasn't famous yet. She wasn't confident yet. She was simply someone who wanted to be seen, not applauded, not admired, just understood. Every audition before this had taught her how easily talent could be overlooked, how often effort could be mistaken for desperation, and how quickly rejection could harden the heart if you let it. Inside the audition room, Keanu Reeves sat quietly near the back, unnoticed by most, his posture relaxed but his thoughts far from calm. Though he had already tasted modest success, he carried none of the arrogance that often followed it. He watched people carefully, not with judgment, but with curiosity, as if every person entering the room carried a story worth listening to. To him, auditions were never competitions. They were moments of courage, people stepping into vulnerability with nothing but words and belief. When Sandra's name was called, he noticed the slight pause before she stood, the almost invisible inhale she took as if steadying herself against something heavier than nerves. Sandra walked into the room and felt the weight of unfamiliar eyes settle on her shoulders. The director looked tired. The producers looked distracted. The clock on the wall ticked louder than it should have. She introduced herself, took her mark, and began reading. Her voice was clear at first, steady even, but halfway through the scene something shifted. Her throat tightened, her breath caught, and a single word came out softer than intended. A sound echoed in the room, not cruel laughter, but enough to make her heart stumble. For a moment, doubt rushed in like a wave, threatening to wash away everything she had prepared. She considered stopping. She considered apologizing. She considered walking out. Then, without meaning to, her eyes found Keanu. He wasn't smiling in encouragement or offering exaggerated reassurance. He was simply watching, fully present, fully attentive, as if her words mattered. There was no judgment in his expression, no impatience, no expectation. Just calm, just belief. In that quiet second, something inside Sandra steadied. She realized that even if she failed, she didn't have to disappear. She took another breath and began again, not trying to impress, not trying to be perfect, but letting the truth of the scene pass through her as it was meant to. Her voice carried emotion now, not polish. The room grew quieter. The director leaned forward. The script stopped being words and became feeling. When she finished, there was silence, not awkward, not uncertain, but the kind that lingers because something real has just happened. Keanu's audition followed shortly after. His performance was restrained, almost understated, but filled with a depth that didn't demand attention. It earned it. Sandra watched from the side, her earlier nerves forgotten, struck by the honesty of his presence. He didn't act pain, he understood it. When the scene ended, the director nodded slowly, as if realizing something important without yet knowing how to say it aloud. As Sandra gathered her things to leave, unsure of what the outcome would be, Keanu stood and crossed the room quietly. "You were really good," he said, his voice gentle and unassuming. It wasn't praise meant to flatter, it was acknowledgement. Sandra looked up, surprised, and smiled softly. "Thank you," she replied, not knowing that this small exchange would stay with her longer than any callback or contract ever could. Outside, rain had begun to fall, blurring the city lights into reflections that looked like possibilities instead of obstacles. Sandra stood beneath a narrow awning, listening to the sound of water against concrete, replaying the audition in her mind. She didn't know if she would get the role. She didn't know if she would ever see Keanu again. But she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time, reassurance that even in uncertainty, kindness could change the direction of a moment. Days later, the call came. She had been cast. When she learned who would be playing opposite her, her heart skipped in recognition. Behind the scenes, she would later learn, Keanu had spoken quietly in her favor, not with arguments or influence, but with simple truth. He had told them she was real, that she listened, that she made the scene feel like something worth watching. Neither of them knew it yet, but that audition wasn't just the beginning of a film. It was the beginning of a connection rooted not in romance or headlines, but in empathy, respect, and the rare courage to see another person fully, before the world told them who they were supposed to be. And that was only the first step. When quiet kindness became strength. The first day on set began long before the sun had fully risen. when the world still felt undecided about waking up, and the film crew moved through the studio with the practiced rhythm of people who had done this 1,000 times before. Sandra Bullock arrived early, clutching a paper cup of coffee that had already gone cold in her hands, her nerves buzzing beneath a calm expression she had learned to wear like armor. This was different from auditions. Here there were expectations, schedules, money, and dozens of eyes depending on her to deliver. She walked through the soundstage slowly, taking in the cables on the floor, the lights being tested overhead, the faint smell of dust and paint that always clung to unfinished sets. Despite the noise and movement, she felt strangely alone, as if standing at the edge of something much bigger than herself. Keanu Reeves arrived quietly, almost unnoticed, dressed simply, greeting crew members with the same gentle nod and quiet thank you he offered everyone, regardless of their role. There was no urgency in his movements, no sense of performance off camera. When he spotted Sandra across the set, he smiled in recognition, not wide or dramatic, just enough to say, "I see you." She felt her shoulders relax slightly, though she hadn't realized how tense they were until that moment. Their first scene together was simple on paper, two people sharing a quiet exchange. But simplicity, Sandra was learning, was often the hardest thing to make believable. As the cameras rolled, the familiar pressure returned, that awareness of being watched, measured, evaluated. Sandra stumbled slightly on a line, then recovered, but doubt crept in immediately, whispering that maybe she wasn't ready for this after all. Then Keanu spoke his line, not loudly, not forcefully, but with a presence that grounded the space between them. He didn't rush her. He didn't overpower the moment. Instead, he made room for it. Sandra felt herself respond naturally, her performance no longer something she was pushing forward, but something unfolding. When the director called cut, there was no rush to reset. A quiet approval settled over the crew, subtle but unmistakable. Between takes, Sandra noticed something that surprised her. Keanu wasn't retreating to a private corner or waiting for someone else to handle things for him. He helped move chairs, thanked the camera assistant for adjusting the angle, listened attentively when a sound technician explained a problem. None of it seemed intentional, like an effort to be admired. It was simply how he moved through the world. During a short break, he handed Sandra a bottle of water without a word, noticing she hadn't reached for one herself. "You'll need it," he said gently. "Long day." She smiled, realizing how rarely anyone noticed the small things when stress took over a set. As the days passed, their rhythm grew more natural. They didn't talk much about fame or future plans. Instead, they spoke about fear, the kind that settles in quietly, convincing you that you don't belong, and about the strange loneliness that can exist even in crowded rooms. One afternoon, while waiting for lighting adjustments, Sandra admitted she still felt like she was pretending, like one wrong move might expose her as someone who didn't deserve to be there. Keanu listened without interrupting, then said softly, "Everyone feels that at some point. The trick isn't getting rid of the fear. It's not letting it decide who you are." His words weren't dramatic, but they stayed with her, echoing long after the cameras stopped rolling. There were moments when things didn't go well. A particularly emotional scene left Sandra frustrated, her performance feeling forced no matter how many takes they did. The director's patience wore thin, the crew grew tired, and Sandra felt the familiar sting of self-blame rise in her chest. She stepped away from the set, trying to steady her breathing, embarrassed by how close she felt to tears. Keanu followed at a distance, giving her space until she was ready. When he finally spoke, it wasn't advice about acting or technique. "You don't owe anyone perfection," he said quietly. "Just honesty." That simple reminder shifted something. When they returned to the scene, Sandra stopped trying to control it and allowed herself to feel the discomfort, the uncertainty. The result was raw and imperfect, and exactly what the scene needed. Late nights became common, the kind where exhaustion stripped away pretense. They sat together between setups, sharing quiet laughter over mistakes, small jokes that never would have made sense to anyone else. Sometimes they said nothing at all, just existing in the same space, comfortable in the silence. Sandra began to realize how rare that was to feel understood without explanation, supported without expectation. She noticed how Keanu never rushed her, never pushed conversations further than they naturally went. There was respect in that restraint, a kind of emotional generosity that didn't demand anything in return. As filming continued, the crew started to notice the change. The chemistry between them wasn't loud or dramatic. It was subtle, grounded, believable. It showed in the way scenes flowed, in how easily they responded to each other, in the way tension softened the moment one of them spoke. Yet off camera, there were no grand gestures, no headlines being written. What existed between them lived in glances, in timing, in the shared understanding that this work mattered not because it might succeed, but because it was honest. One evening after a particularly long shoot, Sandra found Keanu sitting alone near the edge of the set, quietly fixing a loose piece of wood on a prop that no one else had noticed. She asked why he didn't just tell someone else to handle it. He shrugged, smiling faintly. "If I can help, why wouldn't I?" That question stayed with her. It wasn't about the prop. It was about a way of living that didn't separate success from responsibility, talent from kindness. By the time the first week ended, Sandra felt different, steadier, more certain of herself than she had been in years. Not because the fear was gone, but because it no longer felt isolating. She realized that sometimes growth didn't come from proving yourself, but from being around someone who reminded you of your own worth simply by the way they treated you. She didn't know where this experience would lead, how the film would be received, or what the future held for either of them. But she knew one thing with absolute clarity. This project was already changing her, not through applause or recognition, but through quiet moments of trust that made her believe, for the first time in a long while, that she truly belonged. The weight of distance and the strength it revealed. By the time the production moved into its most demanding phase, the rhythm of filming had become both familiar and unforgiving. A cycle of early mornings and late nights that blurred together until days felt less like individual moments and more like a single unbroken test of endurance. Sandra felt it in her body first, the quiet ache in her shoulders, the heaviness behind her eyes, and then in her thoughts, which grew louder whenever exhaustion loosened her careful composure. The set had shifted locations to a vast, half-abandoned industrial space on the edge of the city, a place filled with echoing footsteps, cold concrete, and the constant hum of generators. The scenes planned there were intense, physically and emotionally demanding, and Sandra could sense the tension in the air long before the cameras began to roll. For the first time since filming started, fear crept back in with a sharper edge. These scenes required precision, timing, and a confidence she wasn't sure she possessed yet. As the director explained the sequence, her hands trembled slightly, though she kept them folded together to hide it. She worried about missing a mark, about reacting too slowly, about being the reason everything had to be reset again and again. Keanu noticed the change immediately, the subtle way her breathing shortened, the way her gaze drifted instead of settling. He didn't draw attention to it or offer empty reassurance. Instead, as they waited for the crew to finish setting up, he leaned in just enough for her to hear him and said quietly, "I'll be right there. You won't be alone in it." The words were simple, but they grounded her more effectively than any technical instruction ever could. When filming began, the chaos felt overwhelming at first. The noise, the movement, the sharp calls of action and cut slicing through the space. Sandra focused on Keanu, on the steadiness of his presence, letting it anchor her when everything else felt unpredictable. There was a moment during the scene when something went slightly wrong, not enough to stop filming, but enough to jolt her nerves. Instinctively, she reacted, not with panic, but with honesty, and the moment became more powerful because of it. When the director finally called cut, the silence that followed was heavy, charged, and unmistakably approving. Sandra exhaled, realizing only then how tightly she had been holding herself together. That night, long after most of the crew had left, Sandra stayed behind, sitting on the edge of the set while the lights dimmed and the generators wound down. The space felt different without the noise, stripped down to its bones. Keanu returned carrying 2 cups of tea, handing one to her without asking. They sat there quietly, the warmth of the cup seeping into their hands as the city hummed faintly in the distance. Sandra admitted, almost reluctantly, how close she had felt to failing earlier, how the pressure sometimes made her question whether she belonged in a world that demanded so much certainty. Keanu listened, his gaze fixed somewhere ahead, as if choosing his words carefully. "Fear doesn't mean you're doing something wrong," he said at last. "It usually means you're doing something that matters." The idea settled into her slowly, reshaping the way she viewed the discomfort she had spent years trying to avoid. As filming progressed, attention from outside the set began to grow. Journalists hovered near the gates, rumors formed and reformed with every shared glance caught by a camera. People spoke of their chemistry as if it were something manufactured, something designed to sell tickets. Sandra found the speculation unsettling, not because it was invasive, but because it missed the truth entirely. What existed between them wasn't performative. It wasn't something that needed explanation or defense. It lived in the quiet spaces, the moments no one else noticed. Yet fame had a way of distorting even the most grounded experiences, pulling them into narratives neither of them had written. The strain showed most clearly when production was unexpectedly paused for a short period due to scheduling conflicts and budget concerns. Cast and crew scattered, returning to separate lives that felt oddly distant after weeks of shared intensity. Sandra flew home, grateful at first for the familiar comfort of her parents' house, the steady routines she had grown up with. But as the days passed, she noticed the absence more sharply than she had expected. There was no quiet conversation after exhausting days, no steady presence reminding her to trust herself. The silence felt heavier than it should have, and she found herself replaying small moments from the set, a look, a word, a shared laugh, realizing how much they had come to mean. Keanu stayed behind, using the time to reflect in his own way, walking through the city, riding his motorcycle late at night, letting thoughts surface without forcing them into conclusions. He understood distance well. He had lived with it most of his life. But this time, it felt different, less like solitude and more like something unfinished. He resisted the urge to reach out constantly, believing that some connections needed space to breathe rather than constant reassurance. Still, when Sandra returned to the set and he saw her step through the doors again, tired but smiling, something unspoken passed between them. Relief, recognition, a quiet acknowledgement that the space between them had only clarified what was already there. Shortly after filming resumed, life intervened in a way neither of them could prepare for. Sandra received a phone call late one evening, her face draining of color as she listened. A close friend had been seriously injured, and the words on the other end of the line blurred together until she could barely understand them. Keanu noticed immediately, standing before she even spoke, offering his presence without question. When she told him what had happened, he didn't hesitate or weigh the inconvenience. He simply said, "I'll take you." The drive through the city was quiet, headlights cutting through darkness as Sandra stared out the window, her thoughts spiraling. Keanu drove steadily, focused, as if guiding her through more than just traffic. At the hospital, Sandra finally broke down, the composure she had held onto for so long dissolving under the weight of fear and exhaustion. Keanu waited nearby, giving her space but never leaving. When she emerged, eyes red and shoulders shaking, he didn't ask for details or try to fix what couldn't be fixed. He simply embraced her, a quiet, grounding presence that asked for nothing and offered everything. In that moment, Sandra understood something deeply and unmistakably. That strength didn't always announce itself. Sometimes it stood beside you in silence, reminding you that you didn't have to carry everything alone. After that night, something shifted again, deeper and more permanent than before. The connection between them was no longer just about shared work or mutual respect. It had become a place of refuge, a reminder that even in an industry built on appearances, authenticity could still exist. Neither of them named it. Neither of them needed to. They returned to the set with a renewed sense of purpose, aware that whatever happened once filming ended, the impact of these moments would remain. Sandra no longer questioned whether she belonged. She knew she did, not because the world might applaud her, but because she had learned to trust herself, and because someone else had quietly shown her how powerful kindness could be when it arrived exactly when it was needed most. When the spotlight grew louder than the silence, as the final weeks of filming approached, the atmosphere on set began to change in ways that were subtle at first, then impossible to ignore. What had once felt like a protected space built on trust and shared effort slowly became surrounded by noise, not the physical noise of cameras and crew, but the distant hum of attention, expectation, and outside opinion pressing its way in. The studio executives visited more frequently, conversations grew more strategic, and schedules tightened with the urgency of a project that everyone now believed would matter. Sandra felt the shift keenly. She had grown comfortable in the rhythm of the work, in the quiet understanding she shared with Keanu, but now she sensed the invisible hands of the industry shaping how moments were perceived, how glances were interpreted, how chemistry was discussed as if it were a calculated asset rather than something human and unplanned. Interviews began before filming even wrapped, small promotional conversations at first, then longer ones filled with questions that circled around the same curiosity. Reporters smiled knowingly, hinting at stories they wanted confirmed. Sandra learned to answer carefully, choosing words that revealed nothing yet felt honest enough to be true. She spoke about respect, about collaboration, about how safe she felt working with someone who listened. Keanu did the same, his responses thoughtful but reserved, gently redirecting attention back to the work itself. Still, The speculation grew, and with it came a strange pressure not to act differently, but to be aware that everything they did might now be framed as something it was never meant to be. On set, they adjusted without ever discussing it outright. Their conversations became quieter, more deliberate, not because anything had changed between them, but because the world around them had. Sandra found herself watching Keanu more closely, noticing the way he navigated the attention with the same calm humility he brought to everything else. He didn't shrink from it, but he didn't feed it either. When asked questions that tried to reduce their connection to something simple and marketable, he spoke instead about trust, about how storytelling required honesty, and how honesty required patience. Those answers didn't always satisfy the people asking, but they felt true, and that mattered more. The final scenes they filmed together were among the most emotionally demanding, requiring a depth of vulnerability that left little room for pretense. Sandra felt exposed in a way she never had before, aware that these moments would live on screen long after the set was dismantled. During one particularly intense scene, she felt herself falter, the weight of everything, the attention, the exhaustion, the fear of what came next pressing down all at once. Keanu sensed it instantly. Without breaking character, he adjusted, offering her something to hold on to, a subtle shift that allowed her to regain her footing and finish the scene with honesty intact. When the director called cut, there was a long pause, then quiet applause from the crew, not celebratory but appreciative of something genuine that had just occurred. As the last day of filming arrived, emotions ran high across the set. Crew members hugged, exchanged numbers, promised to keep in touch even though everyone understood how rarely those promises survived the pull of new projects and distant cities. Sandra stood off to the side for a moment, watching it all, feeling both proud and uncertain. This experience had changed her not just professionally, but personally, and she wasn't sure how to carry that forward into whatever came next. Keanu found her there holding 2 cups of coffee, just as he had so many times before. They didn't talk about endings or goodbyes. Instead, they spoke about small things, a missed cue that still made them laugh, a quiet moment early in filming that neither of them had forgotten. It felt important to remember the beginning, to anchor the ending in something real. When the final scene was complete and the director announced that filming had officially wrapped, applause filled the space, loud and sustained. Sandra smiled, clapped along, and let herself feel the pride she had earned. She turned and caught Keanu's eye across the set. He gave her a small nod, the same steady acknowledgement he had offered her in that first audition room, as if to say that everything they had built here mattered, regardless of what came next. Later, as the set emptied and the lights were shut down one by one, they lingered for a moment longer than necessary, aware that this chapter was closing. The premiere arrived weeks later, wrapped in glamour and anticipation. Sandra walked the red carpet feeling both exhilarated and strangely distant, as if part of her was still back on set, untouched by flashbulbs and shouting reporters. When she saw Keanu standing nearby, composed and familiar amid the chaos, a sense of calm returned. They exchanged a brief smile, nothing more, but it carried the weight of shared experience that no headline could capture. Inside the theater, as the lights dimmed and the film began, Sandra watched herself on screen with a new perspective. She didn't see flaws or fear anymore. She saw growth. She saw someone who had learned to trust herself, guided in part by the quiet strength of someone who never demanded credit for it. As the credits rolled and the audience applauded, Sandra felt a mixture of gratitude and acceptance settle into her chest. Whatever the world chose to make of their story was out of her control, and for the first time, that didn't frighten her. She understood now that not every meaningful connection was meant to be defined or claimed publicly. Some existed simply to change you, to prepare you for what came next. As she stood and joined the applause, she glanced at Keanu once more, sharing a look that needed no explanation. They had done the work. They had honored the story. And in doing so, they had quietly honored each other, not with declarations or promises, but with the kind of respect that endured even when the spotlight tried to drown it out. What time reveals when the noise fades. After the premiere lights dimmed and the applause settled into memory, life moved forward with a quiet insistence that felt almost abrupt. Sandra returned to interviews, photo sessions, and press tour that carried her from one city to another, each hotel room blending into the next, each conversation repeating familiar questions framed in different ways. She learned quickly how to smile on cue, how to speak warmly without revealing too much, how to protect something fragile by never naming it. On the surface, everything looked like momentum, a career lifting, doors opening. Yet beneath it all, she felt a stillness she hadn't known before. The kind that comes from having experienced something deeply real and not needing it to be explained or repeated to prove its value. Keanu moved through his own version of distance, traveling for new projects, slipping back into routines that kept him grounded and private. He avoided the louder corners of attention, choosing instead the simplicity of familiar streets, long rides, and conversations that didn't require performance. When asked about the film, he spoke thoughtfully, always returning the focus to the work and the people who made it possible. He never corrected assumptions or fueled speculation. He understood that the truth of certain connections didn't weaken when left unspoken. They strengthened, settling into something durable and internal. Yet even as time passed, he noticed the subtle changes in himself, a patience that had deepened, a renewed commitment to kindness, as if the experience had sharpened his understanding of what truly mattered. Their communication slowed naturally, not from disinterest, but from the simple reality of separate lives pulling in different directions. Messages became less frequent, then occasional, then rare, but never empty. When they did reach out, the words carried weight, encouragement before a difficult day, a brief acknowledgement of a moment that mattered. Sandra found comfort in that restraint. It reminded her that connection didn't have to be constant to be sincere. In the quiet spaces between conversations, she reflected on how much she had changed. She was more confident now, not because she felt invincible, but because she trusted herself to handle uncertainty. She no longer measured her worth by immediate approval or recognition. She had learned that growth often happened in silence, guided by experiences that didn't announce themselves as lessons until much later. Months passed, and the film's success settled into something lasting rather than explosive. Critics continued to praise the authenticity of the performances. Audiences returned to the story again and again, drawn by a sense of honesty they couldn't quite name. Sandra noticed that people often spoke to her differently now, not just as an actress, but as someone whose work made them feel seen. That recognition humbled her more than any award ever could. She understood that the power of the story came not from spectacle, but from the quiet humanity threaded through it, something she had learned to honor both on and off screen. Eventually, fate brought them together again, not through careful planning, but through circumstance. An awards ceremony months later placed them in the same room, surrounded by familiar faces and shared history. When Sandra spotted Keanu across the crowd, the years seemed to fold in on themselves for a moment. He looked the same in the ways that mattered, calm, present, unchanged by the attention around him. Their greeting was simple, unremarkable to anyone watching, yet meaningful in a way only they could understand. They spoke briefly, catching up on projects and small details, careful not to revisit what didn't need revisiting. There was no awkwardness, no sense of loss, only a quiet appreciation for what had been and an acceptance of what was. Later that evening, as they sat side by side during the ceremony, Sandra realized something important. The connection they shared had never been about permanence or definition. It had been about timing, about two people meeting at a moment when they needed exactly what the other offered. Keanu had shown her the strength of calm presence, of kindness without agenda. She, in turn, had reminded him of the impact authenticity could have when it was allowed to exist without armor. Neither had asked the other to be more than they were. That, she realized, was why it endured. As the night came to an end and they prepared to leave, they shared a final conversation, brief but sincere. Keanu thanked her for the work they had done together, for the way it had reaffirmed his belief in storytelling that respected the audience's intelligence and heart. Sandra thanked him in return, not just for the film, but for the example he had set, a reminder that humility and success didn't have to exist in opposition. They parted with a sense of completion rather than farewell, each carrying forward what the other had given without needing to hold on to the moment itself. In the weeks that followed, Sandra found herself approaching new roles differently. She listened more closely, trusted pauses, allowed scenes to breathe. She sought projects that valued depth over noise, sincerity over spectacle. Somewhere along the way, she realized that the most profound changes in her life hadn't arrived with fanfare. They had arrived quietly, shaped by moments of understanding and shared respect. The world continued to move, opportunities continued to arise, but she no longer felt rushed to prove anything. She had learned that sometimes, the most meaningful chapters weren't the ones that lasted forever, but the ones that taught you how to move forward with clarity, grace, and an unshakable sense of who you were becoming. The legacy of one quiet moment. Years passed in a way that felt both swift and deliberate. as if time itself understood that some chapters were meant to settle gently rather than close abruptly. Sandra Bullock's career continued to evolve, shaped not only by success but by intention. She chose roles that challenged her emotionally, stories that asked something deeper of both the audience and herself. In interviews, when asked about turning points in her life, she often spoke in careful terms, referencing moments of learning rather than milestones of fame. She had come to understand that growth was rarely loud. It happened in rooms where no cameras rolled, in conversations that never made headlines, in brief intersections that altered how you saw yourself and the world around you. Keanu Reeves moved through his own years with the same quiet steadiness that had always defined him. While his work gained recognition and admiration, he remained rooted in simplicity, continuing to treat success as something temporary and people as something permanent. Those who worked with him often remarked on the same qualities Sandra had noticed long ago: his patience, his attentiveness, his refusal to let status interfere with decency. Though he rarely spoke publicly about past projects beyond what was necessary, there were moments, when asked about meaningful collaborations, when his expression softened slightly, as if remembering something that existed beyond words. Eventually, the film that had brought them together reached a milestone anniversary, prompting a modest reunion event meant to honor its lasting impact. Sandra hesitated before accepting the invitation, unsure of what emotions it might stir. Time had changed her, softened certain edges while sharpening others, and she wondered whether revisiting that chapter would feel comforting or disorienting. In the end, she decided to go, trusting the same instinct that had guided her through that first audition years ago: the belief that facing meaningful moments, even after time had passed, was worth the risk. The event was held in a small theater, intimate rather than grand, its walls lined with photographs from the production, candid images captured between takes, moments frozen before anyone realized their significance. When Sandra entered, memories surfaced gently rather than forcefully, like familiar music heard after years of silence. Then she saw Keanu standing near the stage, speaking quietly with members of the original crew. His hair showed traces of time, but his presence was unchanged, calm and grounded. When he noticed her, there was a pause, then a smile that carried recognition without surprise. They greeted each other warmly, their conversation flowing easily, untouched by the years that had passed. As they sat together during the screening, watching their younger selves on screen, Sandra felt a quiet gratitude settle over her. She no longer saw the uncertainty that once defined her early career. Instead, she saw courage imperfect, unpolished, but genuine. During a scene that had once challenged her deeply, she remembered the words that had guided her through it, the reassurance that fear didn't mean failure. She glanced at Keanu, who seemed equally absorbed, his expression thoughtful rather than nostalgic. When the credits rolled and the applause filled the room, neither of them stood immediately. They remained seated for a moment, allowing the experience to pass through them without commentary. Later that evening, away from the crowd, they spoke honestly about life, about changes, losses, lessons learned. Sandra admitted that she often thought about how that single project had reshaped her understanding of strength, teaching her that confidence could coexist with vulnerability. Keanu listened, then shared how the experience had reaffirmed his belief that kindness was not a weakness but a discipline, something practiced daily rather than proclaimed. There was no need to revisit what might have been or what others imagined. What mattered was what had been true, the way two people had met at the right moment and left each other better than they had arrived. Before parting ways, Keanu handed Sandra a small folded note, explaining that he had written it long ago and never found the right time to give it to her. She waited until she was alone to open it. Inside were only a few words, simple and unembellished, thanking her for reminding him that sincerity still had a place in a world that often rushed past it. Sandra smiled, feeling a warmth that had nothing to do with longing or regret. It was recognition of a bond defined not by romance or permanence, but by impact. In the years that followed, their paths crossed occasionally, always with the same ease, the same quiet respect. They supported each other from afar, not through constant presence, but through understanding. When asked by younger actors for advice, Sandra spoke often about listening to others, to the work, to the moments that challenged you most. Keanu continued to live by example, showing that success did not require hardness and that humility could exist comfortably alongside achievement. The world would continue to speculate, to romanticize, to search for narratives that fit neatly into familiar shapes. But the truth of their story lived elsewhere, in an audition room where fear met kindness, in a set where trust replaced pressure, and in a connection that never needed to be named to be real. Long after the applause faded and the cameras moved on, what remained was something quieter and far more enduring. The understanding that one moment of genuine empathy could change the direction of a life. And so, the audition that changed everything was never about the role or the film or the success that followed. It was about two people choosing to see each other clearly, if only for a moment, and carrying that clarity forward into everything that came next.